20 R&B stars who were shockingly stupid. They had the voices, the hits, and the respect of an entire generation, yet one reckless decision changed everything. Tonight, we're not celebrating fame. We're exposing the moments when brilliance collided with poor judgment and legacies cracked in public view. These are not rumors, not internet myths, but documented turning points that altered R&B history forever. Some walked away with regret. Others never got a second chance. Stay with us, because every name on this list will challenge how you remember greatness. Subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence and watch until the end, because the final story may change how you see music icons forever. Hank Ballard. Hank Ballard should have been remembered as one of the smartest architects of early R&B, yet history often frames him as a warning. Born John Henry Kendricks, he led the Midnighters and wrote The Twist in 1959, recording it before the song reshaped global pop culture. When Chubby Checker's version exploded, Ballard watched another artist benefit from his creativity, a moment that deeply affected his mindset. Instead of adapting to the changing industry, Ballard grew resentful. As the 1960s progressed, his frustration collided with substance abuse. This was not rumor or exaggeration. His drug arrest in Detroit effectively ended mainstream radio support at a time when labels avoided any. Should talent alone guarantee longevity, or does personal discipline matter more than genius? Ballard continued performing in smaller venues and later earned recognition from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but the damage was irreversible. His songwriting influence lived on through generations, while his own career never fully recovered. His story reminds audiences that brilliance without restraint can fade quickly, even when the music itself refuses to disappear over time. Ike Turner. Ike Turner was once one of the most innovative minds in American music, yet his name today is inseparable from self-destruction. As a bandleader, pianist, arranger, and producer, Turner played a key role in shaping early R&B and rock. His 1951 recording, Rocket 88, is widely cited by historians as one of the first rock and roll records. Musically, his instincts were sharp, disciplined, and years ahead of the industry. However, behind the studio brilliance was a man unraveling in private. By the 1960s and 1970s, Ike Turner's life was dominated by cocaine addiction and violent control over his professional and personal environment. His marriage to Tina Turner became defined by documented abuse, intimidation, and manipulation, facts later confirmed by Tina herself and supported by court records. While the Ike and Tina Turner Revue produced hits and sold out shows, the foundation was cracking. In 1976, Tina Turner escaped after a violent incident ending both the marriage and the partnership. Public sympathy vanished overnight. From that moment forward, Ike Turner was no longer viewed as a pioneer, but as a cautionary tale. Despite later attempts at redemption and musical recognition, his reputation never recovered. His downfall stands as proof that innovation cannot survive unchecked cruelty and that talent without accountability eventually collapses under its own weight. James Brown. James Brown was one of the most disciplined performers music has ever seen, and paradoxically, one of its most self-destructive offstage. Known as the hardest working man in show business, Brown revolutionized rhythm groove and stagecraft. By the late 1960s, he had essentially invented funk, influencing everyone from Prince to hip-hop producers decades later. His catalog sold tens of millions of records, and his live shows set an industry standard. Yet by the late 1980s, cracks became impossible to ignore. Years of heavy drug use fueled paranoia and erratic behavior. In 1988, Brown stormed into an office near his Georgia studio, armed with a shotgun, then fled police in a high-speed chase that crossed state lines. The incident ended with his arrest and a 6-year prison sentence, an outcome confirmed by court records and widely reported at the time. For the first time, the myth of James Brown collapsed in full public view. How does a man so obsessed with discipline on stage lose all control once the spotlight fades? Brown eventually returned to performing, but the aura had changed. The mugshot, the prison time, and the chaos followed him forever. His musical legacy remains monumental, but his downfall proves that relentless work ethic means little without personal restraint. Genius built the empire, recklessness nearly burned it down. Jackie Wilson. Jackie Wilson was called Mr. Excitement for a reason. Few singers in the late 1950s and 1960s matched his combination of vocal range, athletic stage presence, and raw charisma. His hits like Lonely Teardrops and Higher helped bridge gospel emotion with pop accessibility, influencing performers from Elvis Presley to Michael Jackson. On stage, Wilson was explosive, backflip spins and notes that soared effortlessly. Off stage, however, discipline faded. Years of relentless touring, heavy drinking, and ignoring medical warnings slowly eroded his health. Despite industry success, Wilson failed to protect his body, the very instrument that made him legendary. Doctors and close associates later confirmed that he struggled with exhaustion, poor diet, and untreated cardiovascular issues, all common but dangerous realities for performers of his era. On September 29, 1975, while performing in New Jersey, Wilson collapsed on stage mid-song after suffering a massive heart attack. The audience initially applauded, believing it was part of the act. It wasn't. He never fully recovered, spending nearly 9 years in a semi-comatose state until his death in 1984. Jackie Wilson's voice reshaped soul music, but neglect and overexertion silenced it far too soon, turning brilliance into a heartbreaking lesson about self-preservation. Etta James. Etta James possessed one of the most powerful and emotionally raw voices in American music history. From At Last to I'd Rather Go Blind, she could move effortlessly between tenderness and ferocity, earning 6 Grammy Awards and induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Few singers could convey pain, desire, and defiance with such authority. Her influence stretched across soul, blues, rock, and even modern R&B. Yet behind that unmatched vocal strength was a life marked by prolonged struggle. Raised in instability and exposed to trauma at an early age, James battled heroin addiction for much of her adult life. By the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, her dependency repeatedly disrupted recording schedules, tours, and professional relationships. Arrests and court-ordered rehabilitation programs were not tabloid rumors, but documented attempts to pull her back from collapse. Entire stretches of what should have been her prime earning years were lost to recovery cycles. How many classic songs did the world never hear because addiction stole time? That talent alone could not reclaim. Etta James eventually regained control and mounted a celebrated comeback in the late 1980s and 1990s, winning renewed critical acclaim. Still, the cost was enormous financially, physically, and emotionally. Her legacy remains towering, but her story stands as a sober reminder that even the greatest voices are vulnerable when pain goes untreated and discipline arrives too late. David Ruffin. David Ruffin had a voice that defined an era. As the gritty, emotional lead on My Girl, he gave the Temptations their signature edge and helped Motown dominate the 1960s charts. Ruffin's delivery was urgent and vulnerable, instantly recognizable and commercially powerful records, featuring his lead sold in the millions and made the group international stars. But success fed a dangerous belief that he was untouchable. By the mid-1960s, Ruffin's ego and cocaine addiction began to control his decisions. He insisted on separate limousines, missed rehearsals, and demanded the group be billed as David Ruffin and the Temptations. These were not creative differences. They were documented disruptions that strained a tightly run Motown machine. Despite repeated warnings from bandmates and management, Ruffin refused to adjust. In 1968, Motown made the unthinkable move and fired him. Ruffin's response only deepened the damage, showing up uninvited at Temptations concerts and grabbing microphones on stage. Though he scored a few solo hits in the early 1970s, he never regained the stature he once held. Financial trouble, legal issues, and continued substance abuse followed until his death in 1991. David Ruffin didn't lose his legacy overnight, but he steadily dismantled it one unchecked decision at a time. Frankie Lymon. Frankie Lymon became famous before he was old enough to understand what fame demanded or what it could destroy. At just 13 years old, he fronted Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers and co-wrote Why Do Fools Fall in Love, a record that helped define teenage pop and early R&B in the 1950s. His voice was bright, agile, and instantly recognizable, making him one of the first black teen idols in American music history. But the industry that celebrated him offered no protection. Thrust into adult environments, Lymon was exposed to drugs, alcohol, and exploitation while still a child. When his voice naturally deepened during adolescence, record sales collapsed almost overnight. Without guidance or structure, he struggled to adapt artistically and emotionally. Attempts to reinvent himself as a solo singer failed to gain traction, and substance dependence tightened its grip. How different might this story be if a child star had been treated like a child instead of a product? By his early 20s, Lymon was battling addiction and financial instability. In 1968, at just 25 years old, he died from a heroin overdose in his grandmother's bathroom. Frankie Lymon didn't lack talent or opportunity. He lacked protection, preparation, and time. His brief life remains one of the clearest examples of how early fame, without care or boundaries, can turn promise into tragedy. Sly Stone. Sly Stone was not just a star, he was a revolution. As the creative force behind Sly and the Family Stone, he fused soul, funk, rock, and psychedelia into a sound that reshaped American music. By the late 1960s, his band stood for unity, diversity, and optimism, delivering era-defining records like Everyday People and Dance to the Music. They headlined Woodstock and symbolized the future of popular culture. But as success peaked, discipline collapsed. Entering the 1970s, Sly became deeply entangled with cocaine and PCP substances that fueled paranoia and isolation. Concerts were missed without explanation. Promoters lost money. Bandmates waited backstage for hours, unsure if he would appear. This wasn't rumor, it was a pattern documented by managers, musicians, and venues alike. Fear replaced trust and cohesion dissolved. By 1975, the band had effectively disintegrated. Former collaborators walked away, some fearing for their safety. Sly's solo work grew darker and less accessible, mirroring his internal chaos. For decades, he lived on the margins, far from the spotlight he once commanded. Sly Stone changed music forever, but his inability to control excess turned innovation into isolation, proving that vision alone cannot sustain a legacy without responsibility. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack was one of the most gifted and emotionally honest voices in soul music, but a single personal decision nearly erased his future. As a songwriter, guitarist, and singer, Womack helped shape the sound of the 1960s and 1970s, penning classics and delivering timeless records like Across 110th Street. His phrasing was raw, conversational, and deeply human qualities that earned him respect across generations. Yet in 1964, Womack crossed an invisible but powerful moral line. He had been mentored by Sam Cooke, one of the most revered figures in soul music. When Cooke was tragically killed, the community was still in mourning. Just 3 months later, Womack married Cooke's widow, Barbara. The backlash was immediate and severe. Radio stations pulled his records, concert crowds turned hostile, and his reputation collapsed almost overnight. The decision was not illegal, but culturally devastating. Can artistic greatness survive when trust and loyalty are broken so publicly? Womack eventually rebuilt his career in the 1970s through undeniable talent and perseverance, scoring major hits and earning renewed acclaim. Still, the shadow of that moment never fully disappeared. His story proves that in Black music culture, relationships and respect matter as much as skill, and one impulsive choice can cost years of momentum that no amount of talent can instantly recover. Wilson Pickett. Wilson Pickett was pure electricity. Nicknamed the Wicked Pickett, he delivered a ferocity that defined Southern soul-powering classics like In the Midnight Hour and Mustang Sally. His shout-singing style, sharp rhythms, and church-bred intensity made him a force audiences felt as much as heard. In his prime, Pickett sold millions of records and commanded stages with intimidating confidence. That same volatility, however, followed him off stage. Over time, alcohol and erratic behavior chipped away at stability, leading to repeated legal trouble. The most devastating moment came in 1992, when Pickett drove while intoxicated and struck an elderly pedestrian, resulting in a fatality. He was convicted and served jail time, an irreversible consequence rooted in a single reckless choice. The case was widely reported and confirmed by court proceedings, leaving no room for myth-making. After his release, Pickett continued to record and perform, but trust was broken and opportunities narrowed. Health issues followed, and the roar that once thrilled arenas softened into cautionary echoes. Wilson Pickett's legacy remains vital to American music, yet his story underscores a hard truth: power without restraint can turn triumph into tragedy in an instant. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway was one of the most musically sophisticated voices R&B ever produced. Classically trained, he brought orchestral depth to soul arranging and performing songs that blended jazz harmony, gospel feeling, and pop accessibility. Records like A Song for You, The Ghetto, and his duets with Roberta Flack demonstrated a rare balance of intellect and emotion. Hathaway wasn't just singing, he was constructing sound with intention. Behind that brilliance, however, was a serious and documented mental health struggle. Hathaway was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that caused delusions, fear, and auditory hallucinations. In the 1970s, mental illness carried heavy stigma, and effective long-term treatment was limited. Rather than stepping away to stabilize, he continued recording and traveling, placing enormous strain on an already fragile state. Friends and collaborators later confirmed that episodes of paranoia increasingly disrupted his work and daily life. How many artists are celebrated for their output while their suffering is quietly ignored? In January 1979, while staying at a New York hotel during recording sessions, Hathaway experienced a severe episode and fell from a 15th-floor window. He was only 33 years old. His death was not the result of scandal or crime, but of untreated illness overwhelming extraordinary talent. Donny Hathaway's legacy remains timeless, yet his story is a solemn reminder that genius requires care, not silence to survive. Arthur Conley. Arthur Conley was on the brink of becoming one of the defining soul voices of the late 1960s. His explosive hit, Sweet Soul Music, reached the top 10 in 1967 and became an anthem celebrating the black music movement itself. Discovered, managed, and produced by Otis Redding, Conley had the momentum, the sound, and the industry backing to build a lasting career. Then tragedy changed everything. When Otis Redding died in a plane crash later that same year, Conley lost more than a mentor, he lost his anchor. Overwhelmed by grief and increasingly distrustful of the American music industry, he began drinking heavily and withdrawing from professional relationships. Instead of regrouping or seeking guidance, Conley made a baffling decision. He walked away entirely. He moved to Europe, settled in the Netherlands, changed his name to Lee Roberts, and deliberately erased his public identity. In Europe, Conley continued performing in small clubs, intentionally avoiding the fame he once chased. While some admired the escape, the cost was enormous. He surrendered visibility, influence, and financial stability at the exact moment his career should have expanded. Arthur Conley didn't fall because of scandal or crime. He vanished by choice, allowing grief to silence a voice that soul music was still waiting to hear. Rick James. Rick James lived at full volume and paid for it, bursting out of the late 1970s with a sound he called punk funk. James fused hard funk grooves with pop hooks and swagger. Hits like Super Freak and Give It To Me Baby sold millions, dominated MTV, and made him one of the decade's most visible black artists. At his peak, he wasn't just successful, he was culturally unavoidable. But excess soon eclipsed discipline. Cocaine addiction fueled paranoia, erratic behavior, and a collapsing work ethic. Studio sessions derailed, relationships fractured, and legal trouble mounted. The breaking point arrived in the early 1990s when James was arrested and later convicted for violent assaults against women, crimes tied directly to prolonged drug abuse. In 1993, he was sentenced to prison, effectively ending his career as a recording star. When rebellion becomes cruelty, does the art still deserve celebration? After serving time, James returned briefly to public life, most notably through comedic appearances that softened his image but could not erase the damage. Health problems followed, and he died in 2004. Rick James left behind a catalog that still moves dance floors, yet his story stands as a stark reminder that unchecked indulgence can turn brilliance into a cautionary tale almost overnight. Clyde McPhatter. Clyde McPhatter was one of the most influential voices in early R&B, yet his career slowly unraveled in a way that shocked those who knew his talent. As the original lead singer of the Drifters, McPhatter introduced a soaring, gospel-trained tenor that reshaped vocal harmony in popular music. Songs like There Goes My Baby and Money Honey didn't just chart, they laid the blueprint for soul singing that would dominate the next 2 decades. Nearly every great male R&B vocalist who followed owed him something. Despite his success, McPhatter struggled deeply with pressure and insecurity. A stint in the U.S. Army interrupted his momentum, and when he returned, the music industry had already shifted. Unable to adjust emotionally, he turned increasingly to alcohol. What began as a coping mechanism became a dependency that eroded his professionalism. By the late 1960s, his drinking affected performances, missed lyrics, unreliable appearances, and a reputation promoters could no longer trust. Reduced to performing in small clubs for minimal pay, McPhatter spent his final years financially unstable and largely forgotten by the mainstream. He died in 1972 at just 39 years old from complications related to alcoholism. Clyde McPhatter didn't lose his voice. He lost control over the life surrounding it, leaving behind influence far greater than the fortune he never managed to keep. R. Kelly. R. Kelly built one of the most commercially dominant careers in modern R&B before destroying it through his own documented actions. As a songwriter, producer, and vocalist, he shaped the sound of 1990s and early 2000s R&B, writing or producing dozens of chart hits and selling an estimated 75 million records worldwide. Songs like I Believe I Can Fly earned Grammy Awards and crossed into pop, film, and gospel spaces, cementing his influence on a generation of artists. Yet alongside the success were long-standing allegations that followed him for decades. Rather than stepping back or seeking accountability, Kelly repeatedly dismissed criticism and continued operating as if fame placed him above consequences. Court records later showed patterns of manipulation, coercion, and abuse that were not rumors, but supported by testimony, recordings, and corroborating evidence. How does someone with everything choose denial over responsibility when the warning signs are impossible to ignore? In 2021, Kelly was convicted in federal court on racketeering and sex trafficking charges. In 2022, he received a 30-year prison sentence, effectively ending his career and public life. Streaming platforms removed promotional support. Radio erased his presence, and his catalog became inseparable from the crimes attached to it. R. Kelly's fall was not sudden, it was prolonged, avoidable, and self-inflicted. His story stands as one of the clearest examples of how unchecked power and arrogance can collapse even the most profitable legacy. Casey Haley. Casey Haley rose to fame as one of the most emotionally intense voices of 1990s R&B. As the lead singer of Jodeci and later half of the duo K-Chi and JoJo, he helped define a raw, church-rooted sound that blended gospel passion with street realism. Hits like Come and Talk to Me Forever, My Lady, and All My Life sold millions and made him a defining male voice of his generation. But as success grew, discipline weakened. Years of touring and pressure collided with heavy alcohol abuse, slowly undermining his reliability as a performer. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, incidents began spilling into public view. Concerts were marred by slurred vocals, missed lyrics, and visible intoxication moments captured on fan recordings and broadcast widely as camera phones became common. What once felt private now became permanent. The damage went beyond embarrassment. Promoters hesitated, tours stalled, and his reputation shifted from powerhouse vocalist to cautionary example. KC later acknowledged his struggles and entered recovery, attempting to rebuild both his health and credibility. While his voice remains respected, the lost years are undeniable. His story underscores a harsh truth of modern fame. Talent may earn forgiveness, but consistency determines longevity, and the spotlight never forgets. D'Angelo. D'Angelo emerged in the mid-1990s as the quiet architect of neo-soul reshaping R&B with musicianship restraint and emotional depth. Albums like Brown Sugar and Voodoo emphasized live instrumentation, layered harmonies, and classic groove influencing an entire generation. Commercially and critically, Voodoo debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 and went multi-platinum positioning. D'Angelo as a savior of real soul at a time of glossy excess. Then pressure arrived from an unexpected place. The hyper-sexualized video for Untitled How Does It Feel shifted attention from music to image, something D'Angelo openly disliked. Retreat followed. Isolation, heavy drinking, and substance use slowly replaced studio discipline. In 2005, a DUI and drug possession arrest in Virginia released a mugshot that shocked fans, bloated, exhausted, and far removed from the mystique that once defined him. When fame rewards an image you never wanted, how do you protect the art without losing yourself? D'Angelo disappeared from public view for nearly a decade, forfeiting peak earning years and momentum few artists ever regain. His 2014 return with Black Messiah proved the genius never left, but the cost was real. His story isn't about lack of talent. It's about how avoidance, not scandal, can quietly derail even the most respected careers in modern R&B. Jaheim. Jaheim built his reputation on emotional honesty. Emerging in the early 2000s, he stood apart from glossy R&B trends with a raspy, street-rooted voice and lyrics grounded in loyalty, vulnerability, and commitment. Songs like Put That Woman First and Could It Be resonated strongly with adult listeners, earning him multiple top 10 R&B albums and a devoted core audience. Jaheim wasn't marketed as flashy, he was marketed as real. That image made his downfall especially jarring. In 2021, authorities in New Jersey responded to reports at his residence and discovered 15 dogs living in severe neglect, some confined in unsanitary conditions. One animal was so badly affected it had to be euthanized. Jaheim was arrested and charged with animal cruelty. These were not rumors or online exaggerations. Police reports and court filings confirmed the conditions. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. In the social media era, animal abuse carries near zero tolerance. Radio support vanished, bookings dried up, and his name became associated not with love songs, but with neglect. Jaheim's case illustrates a modern truth in today's culture. One verified act of cruelty can outweigh decades of artistic goodwill. His talent was never in doubt, his judgment at a critical moment was. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye is often remembered as the poetic conscience of R&B, but behind the velvet voice was a man whose worst enemy was himself. By the early 1970s, Gaye had achieved a level of creative freedom few black artists had ever known. What's Going On 1971 was not only a commercial success, selling over 2 million copies, but a cultural landmark that challenged Motown's hit factory model. Yet, success intensified his internal conflicts rather than calming them. Gaye struggled with long-term substance abuse, particularly cocaine, which fueled paranoia, erratic behavior, and prolonged creative paralysis. Instead of consolidating his artistic peak, He repeatedly withdrew from recording, delaying albums, and alienating collaborators. At the height of his fame, did Marvin Gaye begin running from the very responsibility his music placed on him. Financially, Gaye's decisions proved catastrophic. 2 expensive divorces combined with years of unpaid federal taxes left him owing the IRS more than $600,000 by the late 1970s, equivalent to several million dollars today. In 1979, to avoid arrest for tax evasion, he fled the United States and lived in exile in Europe, particularly in Belgium, where he relied on friends for basic support. Even his comeback with Sexual Healing in 1982, which won 2 Grammy Awards and restored his chart presence, failed to stabilize his life. The income was quickly consumed by debts and addiction, leaving him financially exposed once again. The final chapter was tragically avoidable. Returning to Los Angeles, Gaye moved back into his parents' home, despite a long history of violent arguments with his father. On April 1, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was fatally shot by his own father during a domestic dispute. The man who sang about healing love and social unity died in chaos, not because of a lack of talent, but because he never learned to protect himself from his demons. Marvin Gaye didn't lose to the industry. He lost to unchecked choices that slowly dismantled a genius from the inside. Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass rose to fame as one of the most commanding voices in R&B history, but his career was repeatedly shaped and shaken by decisions that carried lifelong consequences. Emerging in the early 1970s as the powerhouse lead singer of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Pendergrass quickly became a solo sensation after breaking away in 1976. His run of albums, Teddy Pendergrass 1977, Life is a Song Worth Singing 1978, and TP 1979 produced platinum sales and established him as a dominant force in soul music. Yet behind the sold-out concerts and devoted female fan base, Pendergrass lived at an exhausting pace, driven by excess touring, limited rest, and a belief that momentum could never slow. That illusion shattered on March 18, 1982, when Pendergrass was paralyzed from the chest down after a high-speed car crash in Philadelphia. The accident abruptly ended his reign as one of R&B's most electrifying live performers and forced a complete reinvention of his life. While he later regained partial mobility and courageously returned to recording, releasing Love Language 1984 and Joy 1988. The physical and emotional toll was immense. Medical care reduced touring income, and prolonged rehabilitation altered both his finances and independence. The crash was not the result of malice, but it exposed how a lifestyle built on constant motion left little margin for error. In later years, Pendergrass faced additional scrutiny when a civil lawsuit alleged he had knowledge of wrongdoing related to a former associate. Although he was never criminally charged, the controversy complicated his public image during a period when his health was already declining. Diagnosed with colon cancer in the early 2000s, he died in 2010 at age 59. Teddy Pendergrass remains a symbol of resilience and vocal mastery, but his story is also a cautionary reminder. Even icons can misjudge risk, and one moment of recklessness can permanently rewrite a legacy built over decades. R&B history proves that brilliance alone is never enough. Talent opened doors for these artists, but judgment decided how long those doors stayed open. From addiction and ego to neglect and denial, the most damaging choices were rarely made on stage. They happened in private when accountability faded. These stories aren't meant to cancel legacies, but to examine them honestly. Great music can coexist with terrible decisions, and both truths deserve to be acknowledged. So here's the question we leave with you at Legends of Black Excellence. Should we separate the art from the actions, or do personal choices permanently redefine how greatness is remembered?